I do appreciate that thought, and I hope we'll get to that at the end of this lesson. How beautiful heaven must be. Glad to see you. Thankful for the presence of each one. We have now for a lesson or so been looking at the subject of thinking of ourselves in terms of being servants of Christ, servants of God, and all that word servant suggests. I think we live in a world that is, it seems to me, allergic to the idea of serving anybody. We think that we're the boss, and we fail to realize the fact that in the ultimate sense, now this is not political in any way, I'm just saying when people say no kings, I've heard that recently, maybe you have too, and I think, well, there's King Jesus, how about that? And we may not want to live in a land where there are kings, but there have been plenty of kings through the years. Some of them good, some of them not good. But I wonder if sometimes there is a streak in us, and maybe in our society in particular, which says, we don't answer to anybody. Boy, that's a huge mistake. Because in the ultimate sense, we all answer to God. And so we've talked about servants and being servants of God. And we've made the point, I hope, and reminded you, this is, I hope, familiar to all of us, that every one of us is a servant. The word deacon means servant, but this is not just about deacons or about elders, though they're included in it. It's about every member of God's kingdom, man, woman, and child. Every member of this congregation is a servant of God. If we're not, then we're not what we ought to be. Of course, we talked about areas in which we are called to serve, and we looked at how that sometimes that word service can be one with the idea of worship. Worship is a form of service. We talk about the services, and we know what that means. And what we do together when we come and sing together and take the Lord's Supper together and so on, pray together, this is service, but that's hardly all of it. There's all kinds of service that we are called to do, and we looked at some Bible examples of that. Serving others, benevolence, giving our body as holy. All of those things likewise are service that God expects and demands of us. And we also talked about the fact that in the Bible, there are servants and then there are servants. There are some servants that are good servants and some that are wicked and slothful. And every one of us, I hope, in thinking about these verses, will be moved to ask the question, which side of the ledger am I on? What kind of servant am I? One day the Lord's going to tell me. Well, what would He say if I had to answer today? If today was the day of reckoning? And we looked last time at the question, what kind of mindset is necessary to be a good and faithful servant? There are several answers to that. We'll probably not give all of them. But one thing we looked at last time was that it calls on us to be hardworking and to have that mentality that we owe. We looked at Luke 17. And that's where Jesus said, when you have done everything, all your duty, then say to yourself, I am an unprofitable servant. I've done that which was my duty to do. That's the context in which He says, a servant doesn't come in and say, boy, I'm hungry. He gets the master served first. Maybe that sounds harsh to our modern ears, but if you put it on another level, when you go to a restaurant to sit down and pay for a meal, you'd be rather horrified if the waiter said, look, I'll get to you. I got to eat my lunch right now. That's just not the way that works. There's the role of serving. And that service doesn't say me first. And that's true certainly when it comes to Christ. And if I do everything, then what have I done but just what was my duty to do? We looked at Philippians chapter 2, and Paul describes himself. He's calling on the Philippians to serve God, serve one another. And he says in Philippians 2, if I be poured out as a drink offering upon the sacrifice and service of your faith, I rejoice, and I want you to rejoice with me. Do you see yourself as expendable? In another place, I don't think we talked about this passage, he says, we have the treasure of God in earthen vessels. And if we're just the old clay pots, we're not the treasure. We carry the treasure. Great. That's the way we look at ourselves, as being tools in the hand of God, servants of God. and in His service serving one another. We looked at Mark chapter 10 also, where Jesus made the point, you don't think about greatness as the Gentiles do. When the Gentiles think about greatness, they think about how many people they command. But as you think about greatness, think about it in terms of how many people you serve. The servant, if any man would be great, let him be servant of all. Exactly. Is that the way you think, the way I think about life? All of us know these passages. We've heard them many times. But how do I apply them to myself? We looked at John 13 as a great and moving example. Every time we read this passage about the Lord, on the night He was going to be betrayed, they had finished the Passover, He was going to institute the Lord's Supper. And in that time, in that moment, there had been no servant provided to wash their feet. Now the disciples had been bickering that very day, that very occasion, about who's the greatest, who's the greatest. And they weren't thinking about, well, maybe you're the greatest. No, everybody thought they were the greatest. And that's when the Lord put aside His outer garment, got a towel and a bowl and water, and He began to wash the disciples' feet. All of them. Peter was horrified by that. He said, no, I need to do this. And then after he got through, he said, you see what I've done for you? You call me master. That's right. If I wash your feet, you wash one another's feet. Not as a ritual, not as some sort of a show, but as the idea of I don't care how menial it seems. We're not too good. It's a worthy work if we can serve another, if we can serve our brother, our sister. And God accepts that service. That's who we are. We're not masters as the world thinks of it. We are the servants. Servants of God and servants of one another. I want to mention a couple of more, if I may, this morning. I hope to finish this up. But I think it's so important. It's good for me to think about these things. And I'll say this. I probably already said it. I'll tell you, if you want to grow as a Christian, you need to make sure you are 100% a servant of God. And if we want this church to get bigger, you know, wish we had more people. We could have fewer. God has blessed us with what we have. But I believe this, and I know you believe this. If we have a building full of servants, people committed to serving God, understand what that means, we're going to be able to do work for God in this place that will please God and bless other people. God, help me to have that kind of spirit. Hard work, that's a part of the mindset. Loyalty. A loyalty to the one that we serve, to our master. We're the bondservant, He's the master. And whatever we do has to be in regard to His will. You know, when you read a passage like Galatians 1, Paul is writing to a very troubled area. Brethren there have been infected by false doctrine. And Paul writes to them in maybe the hardest letter of the New Testament, maybe. And he says, I marvel, I'm just amazed when I think about you, that you are so soon removed from Him that called you into the grace of Christ to another gospel. I came and taught you the saving gospel. And somebody else has come in there and sung some song for you and sold you on a bill of goods, and now you're going the opposite direction. You've forgotten the basics of what saved you. You have been removed from the grace of Christ to another gospel. It's not another good news, not really. But there are some that trouble you and would pervert the gospel of Christ, but though we or an angel from heaven preach any other gospel than that which has been preached to you, let him be accursed. I said before, I say again, if any man preach any other gospel other than that which I have preached to you, let him be accursed. Now look at verse 10. He says, for do I now persuade men or God, or do I seek to please men? For if I yet please men, I should not be the servant of Christ. That's the emphasis I want to make of that last phrase. There's not but one way to God. That's His way. Anything else is an effort to please men, and if that's what I'm about, I've left my purpose. I've left it all. I think about that passage in 1 John 2 that we've read so many times. Love not the world, neither the things that are in the world. If any man love the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For all that is in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, the pride of life, not of the Father, but of the world. And the world passes away in the lust thereof, but he that does the will of God abides forever. He's talking about those who love their master and who follow his will. It's really a question of love. Notice how he starts there. You know, whoever you're following, that's who you love. Whatever you obey, that's what you love. And I can't say I love God and follow the world. So the servant always has that mindset of loyalty to his master's will. James 4 says it in other words, but the same point. Ye adulterers, ye adulteresses, you adulterous people, this translation says, do you not know that friendship, philia, with the world is enmity with God? Wherefore whosoever wishes to be a friend, philos, that's the word that we sometimes translate love. There's a love in who you follow. There's a love in whom you please and serve. What he says is that if you serve the world, if you love other things, you can't be the friend of God. You can only be the enemy of God. He'll be first or not at all. I think about the words of Jesus in Matthew chapter 6 and verse 24. No man can serve two masters. He'll hate the one and love the other. He'll be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money. Exactly. And so he says here, by your actions you're going to show who's first. And God says, if I'm your master, you've got to show that by being obedient. My will has to be the most important thing in everything you do. Where am I going to work? Who am I going to marry? What am I going to do with today or if God gives us tomorrow? How do we worship? Where do we work? All those are questions, important questions, and 100 others, 1,000 others. But they have to come down to the idea of how will this help me serve God? What's the effect of my choices on my service to God and my ability to serve others in His name? I think about that passage in 2 Corinthians 2. This is where you remember Paul writing in another letter, writes back referring to that first letter we call 1 Corinthians, an earlier letter, in which he said, you have someone in the church, a brother that's taken his father's wife. I'm not sure that even in our mixed up society that wouldn't be frowned on. That is a very horrifying, twisted idea. And he said, you're proud about it. What you ought to do is you ought to mark that one as one that stands with Satan. Deliver him to Satan for the destruction of the flesh, that the spirit might be saved. Well, he may have had kinfolks there. He may have been a popular fellow there. He may have been a fellow who helped people in some other ways. Whatever it wasn't easy to do that, but Paul said, do it. Well, in this next letter we call 2 Corinthians, he's writing about that, and I think the brethren did, indeed, by and large, do what Paul had commanded them in the name of the Lord. And so in 2 Corinthians 2, he writes back about that situation when he said to them, I don't want you to eat with him. I don't want you to associate with him. I want you to make him feel ashamed. And he writes about that and he says, if anyone is caused grief, he has not grieved me, but you all to some extent, not to be too severe. This punishment which was inflicted by the majority is sufficient for such a man. I think we can understand necessarily inferred there that the man was treated in such a way that he began to be ashamed of his conduct and made a change. It was sufficient for such a man. So that, on the contrary, you ought rather to forgive and comfort him. Don't forgive him if he's continuing in his wickedness, but he's made a change. You ought to recognize that change. Don't feel like you've got to continue to punish a penitent man because I wrote to you about the matter. Paul said, it's not about me. He had said in that first letter, it's about several things. One thing it's about trying to win this brother back. Another thing it's about is trying to protect the church. A little leaven leavens the whole lump. But there's a third reason that he mentions in this passage. On the contrary, verse 7, you ought rather to forgive him and comfort him, lest such a man should be swallowed up with overmuch sorrow. Therefore, I urge you to reaffirm your love to him. For to this end also I wrote. Well, he wrote for several reasons, but here's another. That I might put you to the test whether you are obedient in all things. What's he saying? He's saying, in challenging you with this difficult command, God's going to find out whether you really respect His will or not. What would a servant of God do? He'd respect the master, wouldn't he? Exactly. Romans chapter 6. Verse 15, Paul in this great treatise on salvation writes, what then? Shall we sin because we're not under law but under grace? God forbid. You know, Jesus, we'll not take time right now, but Jesus had a lot to say about that. He came to call people to a higher law, even than the law of Moses. But He in no way wanted people to think that He was encouraging anybody to break the law while they lived under it, keep it. Because a man who breaks the law of Moses is not going to be worth anything when my kingdom comes, which was just a short time, of course, after His death and burial and resurrection. But anyway, he's saying there, the preaching of grace does not encourage any right-minded person into sin. Verse 16, know ye not that to whom ye yield yourselves servants to obey, His servants you are to whom you obey, whether of sin unto death or of obedience unto righteousness. That's the great point that we've thought about, I hope, many times, maybe not enough in my case. But I'll tell you whose servants you are. I'm a servant of God. You got to prove it. It depends on how you live. We should have been made free by obeying the truth from the heart. We should have been made free from sin. And we should have set a course to be a servant of righteousness. But you've seen something like this if you hadn't seen this particular sign. It says something like this. If it were a crime to be a Christian, would there be enough evidence to convict you? That's a great question. Think about that. Now when I'm here, I'll sing these songs, these good songs that we've sung this morning. But when I'm out with another group, I might act very differently. My language may be different. My behavior may be different. I may go into places that I might not be proud for anybody here to know I go. Okay. And then your brain lies to you and says, well, you're serving God. This doesn't count. Oh, it counts. It counts. His servants you are to whom you obey. My point in this is let me hold to Jesus, to be loyal to His will, no matter the cost, no matter who opposes me. Loyal as if He was present. Would that make any difference? Would I talk any different? Would I make any different choices if the Lord was standing there right there with me, bodily? We'll not take the time right now, but I think about that story in 2 Kings chapter 5 about Gehazi. Remember Gehazi? That was the servant of Elisha. After the great story of Elisha and this Syrian general who came down looking for healing and found it. The power of God being extended to him there. He wanted to give all kind of gifts, and Elisha said, no, you keep them. This is not something you can buy, and this is not my doing. But Elisha had a servant named Gehazi, and it just absolutely flew all over him. He said, my master's going to send this Syrian. They didn't like the Syrians very much. These Syrians back home and with all his stuff. So after he got away from his master, he went and ran after the great general. He said to him, my master said he's actually had a couple of people come, sons of the prophets, and he's wondering if he might have some of that loot. He asked for a little bit, and the general gave him a lot. Oh yeah, be glad, take it. And so he had it brought back to the house and buried there, and hid it. And then he went to see his master. And Elisha said to Gehazi, he said, where'd you go? Oh, I didn't go anywhere. And you remember what the prophet told him? He said, did I not see you when you went? He didn't fool God for a moment. And he said, the leprosy of Naaman will be on you. And it was. His problem was, while even he was standing with the prophet and he was doing some of the things the prophet said, his heart wasn't with God or with the prophet. His heart wasn't loyal to his master. God helped me to not do that. and to understand the wickedness and the danger of that. Something else that I want to say. I think I need to develop more gratitude. This is a modern speech translation of Philippians 1:29, where Paul talks about it's been given to you to serve Christ. One modern speech translation renders it this way: for you have been given the privilege of serving Christ. Exactly. Now that's a pretty good way to think about it. How many of us think about the privilege? I trust we do. But is it possible that I might wake up some morning and not think about the privilege it is to be a Christian, to know Christ, and to be accepted by Him, sinful as I am, on the basis of His grace and His mercy? I think about Psalm 84. In this psalm of the sons of Korah, there's this passage: O Lord God of hosts, hear my prayer. Give ear, O God of Jacob. For a day in thy courts is better than 1,000. And I had rather be a doorkeeper in the house of my God than to dwell in the tents of wickedness. Think about Korah, standing there in his tents, rebelling against Moses. And the prophet said, you can keep all the tents of riches and the tents of the worldly and the tents of the proud. I'd rather, if I'm just the fellow keeping the door at the house of the Lord, I'm better off and well pleased with that. I think that's that spirit of gratitude, that sense of importance in being with God, in fellowship with God. I thought about this. You may recognize this picture here. This is the tomb of the unknown soldier in Washington, D.C. at Arlington Memorial. If you've ever been up that way and have ever seen that, this is the tomb that represents all of the fallen, even those whose names are not known. And so it's a national intention to honor those who have given such a sacrifice. And that tomb is guarded 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. You will find a guard at that place. Now, as I understand it, and I did some reading on it, and you may know more than I do about it, but one thing is sure: the folks who are there are not just people they picked off the street. They're people who are the best of the best and who have to apply and volunteer for this service. And this service involves testing, it involves knowing, it involves an immaculate uniform, it involves the understanding and the ritual, the steps that are involved, 7, I think, different steps that are involved in this process as the article described it. And these folks are out there when it's 100 degrees in Washington and when it's the snow on that fellow's cap looks at least 2 inches, and he's walking. So you think about these people, and what did they do bad in order to have to stand out in the rain like? They didn't do anything bad. They count it a great privilege because they're involved in a service they believe in. That's my point. Now let me say, these are men who are servants of the country, and we're servants of Christ. Do we understand what a privilege it is to serve Him in all the ways we've talked about? But let's just think about the public service. To understand what a privilege it is to teach those classes that we teach together. To teach this assembly as I'm doing now. I'll just throw something together. It doesn't really matter. God forbid. To serve the Lord's Supper. To lead the singing of God's people. To lead them in prayer. Got to beg somebody to do that? I volunteer for it and then not even bother to notice while I'm gone somewhere and we're scrambling around trying to find somebody to replace me? What's wrong with me? You think that happens with these guys? Oh, Charlie didn't show up today. I wonder what? Well, he probably just forgot it. Never. Is their service more important than ours? I need to turn up my appreciation, I think. I'm speaking personally. Don't ever forget what a privilege it is to be able, in whatever we do,
if I'm emptying the wastebaskets, is that important? I believe it's important. We'll say more about that in just a second. But, 1 Corinthians 10 comes to mind. Do not grumble as some of them did and were killed by the destroying angels. Talking about Israel, times past. I think one of the things that they did is they forgot what a privilege it was to follow God. They thought it was a burden. God help me not to do that. To serve God with confidence. That's another part of our mindset. Confident because God will not forget. He will not forget. We'll not take the time to do this justice, but Hebrews chapter 10. Here are these Hebrew Christians who come out of Judaism and they're being pulled and tempted to go back to their old ways and thus to leave Christ in the process. And what he says is, God forbid. Remember those former days when you made the choice to serve Christ. It was not easy and you suffered for it. In the days after you were illuminated. I love that translation of that. When the light came on and you saw Christ and you embraced Him. You endured a great struggle with sufferings, partly while you were made a spectacle, both by reproaches and by tribulations, and partly when you stood there as a companion to those who were treated in that way. You had compassion on me in my chains, the writer says there. Therefore, verse 35, do not cast away your confidence, which has great reward, for you have need of endurance, so that after you have done the will of God, you may receive the promise. And he quotes Psalm 45, he that promised he'd come will come. And the real question is not whether he's going to come and reward. The question is whether I will be faithful. I think about that passage in 1 Corinthians 15. Your labor is not in vain in the Lord. But in Hebrews chapter 6, earlier he had made that same point with them. God is not unrighteous to forget your work and labor of love which ye have shown toward His name, in that ye have ministered to the saints and do minister. And so he says, show the same diligence. Don't quit, don't let up, hold on, hold fast in full assurance of hope to the end. Don't be slothful. Believe this. God knows and He will remember. It's a shame. We talk about a thankless job. No job that's worth doing should ever be thankless, but sometimes they are. But one thing you can count on, and I can count on in our life, if we're doing the right thing and it's a thankless job, it won't be thankless with God. If men don't appreciate you as they should, and sometimes they will not. Sometimes I don't appreciate people as I should. God forgive me. But I know that nothing escapes His attention. We think about that great expression from the Lord in Matthew 10. It's recorded one place, verse 42. Whoever gives one of these little ones even a cup of cold water because he's a disciple, truly I say to you, he will in no means lose his reward. Exactly. That's the mind of a servant serving God. Knowing that if nobody notices, nobody cares, nobody appreciates it, God appreciates it. And I won't be sorry when I meet Him that I've made the right decision. Confident in every circumstance. Even bondservants. It's hard to get, a physical bondservant. Here's a man who doesn't even have the freedom to be able to leave, to go here or there. What can he do? He can do right. He can do all he can. He can work heartily as for the Lord and not for men, knowing that from the Lord you will receive the inheritance as your reward, for you are serving the Lord Christ. In our daily life, at school, at work, even if we were in a situation like this, which none of us have ever been in. But some have, some still are. No matter how far down the ladder we get, we can still do what's right and know God knows. And in fact, sometimes in those difficult situations, we can do even greater service for God. We can let our light shine in the darkest times. Don't you think about that passage in Acts 16? When Paul and Silas had been thrown into prison there in Philippi, the jailer received them. They'd already been beaten with many blows, he says here. The jailer was ordered just to keep them safe, so he put them in the inner prison, fastened their feet into stocks. You know what stocks are? There's a picture of them. That'd be uncomfortable, wouldn't it? Have your feet like that, just raised up enough you can't lay down. But of course, they've been beaten, I suppose. They'd have all kind of bruises on them. It's hard to sit up, just torturous in and of itself. But you wouldn't go anywhere. But about midnight, after all of this, Luke records that Paul and Silas were praying and singing hymns to God, and the prisoners were listening to them. I'm sure every time we read that passage, don't we think about, I wonder if that's what I'd be doing. I'd be crying, or I'd be grumbling, or I'd be mad, or I hope not. But I'd flatter myself to think that I would have the faith these men did. But when that earthquake came, and it certainly did, and the foundations were shaken, and the jailer just knew everybody had escaped, he was about to kill himself when Paul cried out, "We're still here." And that's when he sprang in with a light, trembling with fear. He falls down before Paul and Silas, and he asked them this question: "What do you think that was? You think that was a 0.5 earth?" No, that's not what he's worried about. Why didn't y'all leave? That's not really what he's worried about either. He says, "What must I do to be saved?" I don't know. You know, he was sleeping during part of this time. But there was something about these men and their conduct that said, "You know God like I need to know Him. And boy, I need to know Him. And I've just found out how shallow my life is and how I need to know Him." And when that moment comes, God help us to be ready. And if we're servants of Christ as we ought to be, even in the darkest time, we will be ready. And we'll be able to bless others. Isn't that the point in 1 Peter chapter 3? I don't want you to be like the world and return evil for evil. I want you to do the hard thing. I want you to be above all of that. Return good for evil. Because that's the promise of God. And then in verse 13, he asked this question: who ultimately really can harm you if you be followers of what's good? Don't be afraid of their terror. Don't be troubled. But verse 15, sanctify, set apart the Lord God in your hearts, and be ready always to give an answer to every man that asks you a reason of the hope that is in you with meekness and fear. When we read this verse, we remember God says, I want you to live with such an obvious hope on such a different plane than what the world will do, which is just the easy thing, the natural thing, as sometimes we say. Well, it's become nature to be selfish and to be short-sighted. But when you're the opposite of that, people are going to say, what have you got that allows you to deal with this situation as you are? And that's when you can tell them. Being a servant in this sense with this mindset will help us in that regard. It reminds us of what the Lord said. In the same way, let your light shine before men, that they may see your good deeds, your good works, and glorify your Father which is in heaven. And then finally, all of that through our life will allow us to leave this life with confidence. We're talking about having confidence that no good deed ultimately is forgotten by God, and that the hard times can help us in our service to God. But that passage in 2 Timothy 4, some of the very last words that we have from the Apostle Paul, this last letter we have from him, he's writing to a beloved brother, Timothy, and he says to him in verse 6, I am ready to be offered, and the time of my departure is at hand. I have fought a good fight. I have finished my course. I have kept the faith, and there is a crown of righteousness laid up for me, and not for me only, but for all those that love His appearing. Every time we read this verse, our prayer, no doubt, is, Lord, help me to leave this life with this confidence. But here's the thing. It doesn't happen by accident. It doesn't happen automatically. It happens because a man like Paul had through his life made choices that gave him that confidence. He was about to be executed for the cause of Christ. But here's what he could do. He could come to the end of his life and he could look back and he could say, I've certainly made my mistakes and I've needed for God's forgiveness, but I can say honestly that I have done my best to be loyal to Christ. And if you and I will do that, and we can, whatever failures we've made yesterday, we can start today. If we do that, then we can live with that and we can die with that. But it takes being a servant of Christ, having a servant's heart. I'll say again, I believe that will help me, and I believe it will help my family, and I believe it will help me to help the church if I make the commitment. Not to say, well, I wish so-and-so would be a better servant. Okay. But really, what I need to do is make sure what kind of servant I am. And I can then be able to help others. And God deserves it. And we know that to be so. Thank you so much for your kind attention. I hope these reminders have been useful in reminding us of who we are and what God expects of us. If you're here this morning, you're not a child of God, now's the time to be baptized into Christ, to be raised to walk in newness of life. That's another way of saying service. Maybe we're here as a child of God, but our service is not what it needs to be. Then make changes today. Do what's right today. Put Him first today. He'll help you. But He's not going to do it for us. He demands, He never asks more of me than I can do, but He expects me to do all I can. God, help me in that regard. If you need the prayers of the saints, if there's some way we can assist you, help you, then let us know how right now while we stand.